Hi there, fellow sea glass lovers. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm Jackie, and in today's video, I'm going to show you how to add a little bit of color to your sea glass using watercolor paint. Now, if you joined me last week for my video, I showed you how to use a little bit of color using acrylic paint, and it's really quite effective. So it depends on the effect you want. So acrylic paint is going to give you fairly vibrant color, but if you want just a really faint color, it can be nice to use watercolor paint. So I'm going to show you how to do that today. Now, if you look at a piece like this one, there's a fair amount of color in this piece, but it's all natural. It's all the actual color of the sea glass, and there's quite a few pieces of pottery that have some color in it as well. That is the pieces as they were found at the beach. And that's the way I typically do my art. But sometimes I just want to add a little bit of an effect. And today I'm doing a piece where I'm including a dragonfly. And the dragonfly is kind of fading into the background. So I want to add a tiny bit of color just to get that translucent effect that you can get on an actual dragonfly and to draw a person's eye in a little bit closer to the dragonfly. So let me show you how I do that. So here's my dilemma. I am creating this sea glass mosaic and I want to put a dragonfly right here. And I've picked out these 4 spectacular pieces of white sea glass for the dragonfly wings. But the background in this section is white. There is going to be a bit of a brown piece coming through it. But because it's white, I'm afraid my dragonfly wings are going to get a little bit lost with the white background. So I'm going to try the watercolor paint on the back of these just to give them a bit of a pop and make them look a bit like translucent dragonfly wings. So in my last video, I showed you how I had these really dynamic colors of sea glass, and I used some acrylic paint to try to duplicate or represent those colors. But sometimes your sea glass is really pale. So here I've got some really pale, authentic sea glass, and I want to try and create more of a subtle look. So I'm going to try the watercolor paints instead of the acrylic paints because watercolor isn't going to give you quite as much pigment, and it might help you get more of a really pale shade of sea glass color in your white sea glass. So before I paint on these spectacular 4 pieces of white sea glass, I'm going to do some experimenting. Now, I know I don't have to be too concerned because if I don't like the effect, it will wash off. This is water-soluble paint after all. So I've taken these 4 colors of watercolor paints and put a tiny bit in my tray. So I have some violet, some cobalt blue, some viridian, some lemon yellow, and some vermilion. Now these pieces of sea glass right here are the actual colors of the sea glass, and this is what I'm trying to duplicate, these pastel-y colors of sea glass that I actually find at the beach, because all of these are quite rare. So I'm just going to take I just have a small brush, and I'm going to do a little bit of the watercolor and paint on the back. Now that is a very, very faint addition of color, which is kind of what I'm going for here, to see if I can get a pastel-y color on the front. Now this is a case where less is more, because you don't want to have too much paint if what you're going for is a really faint color. I am finding that the water will tend to bead a little bit, so it takes a bit of fussing, but that's okay. You just want to get a little bit of color added to the back of that piece of sea glass. And then I'm going to let this dry really well before I flip it over and see how well it's working. You can kind of tell though, if you lift that up, I can see a little bit of a shade of pink coming through on that one, and it doesn't look that different. than the actual pink sea glass. So now these are dry, and when I flip them over, you just get a hint of color coming through from the back to the front of the piece of sea glass. And where the sea glass is still really frosty on the front, it does give a really nice effect that's somewhat similar to the actual sea glass that is colored. Now I am a bit of a fan of blues and greens, so I'm really tempted to do these wings in blue and green. But the person I'm doing this piece for is quite a fan of reds and oranges and yellows, so I think I'm going to do them in that color. So what I'm going to do, I'll start with this one. I'm going to take some of my yellow paint, and I want quite a bit of yellow. So I'll put quite a bit of yellow in the bottom of the piece, or I call it the bottom, but it would be towards the body of the dragonfly. And then in the middle, I'm going to do some of this orangey red. And then I'm going to put, I'm just dipping in my water and dabbing on the paper towel here between colors. I'm going to put a tiny bit of a purple at the end. And that's all I'm going to use for color. And now I'm going to take my wet brush, not too wet, and then just kind of play with the colors and blend them a bit the way you can with watercolor. Because I want these colors to kind of flow together. Because in a real dragonfly, you don't see the colors of the dragonfly really distinct from one another. They kind of flow together because a dragonfly's wings are actually quite translucent. So I think that's all I'm going to do. So yellow towards the center. Again, lots of yellow. And then tiny bit of the orangey red. And just a hint of purple on the end. I'm not going for a ton of color here. I'm just going for that translucent effect, which is why I then want to do my water. These are watercolor paints. So go for a watercolor effect. Each wing is going to be a bit different. Get too much water, just dump it off. There we go. Now I've got some interesting color. So I'm going to let that dry before I glue these pieces into my final piece. And you can, before it's dried, you can flip them over to take a little look to see if you like the effect. I don't have too much color here. And these are thick pieces of sea glass, so I don't have a whole lot showing through, but I think it's going to be enough to make it interesting. So now the dragonfly wings have dried, and I'm going to take those pieces and flip them over and put them into my sea glass piece. And even though it's just a tiny bit of paint, it's really adding a lot of interest to my dragonfly. And I think this is going to work quite nicely. Whoops, I got those ones mixed up. There we go. So eventually, hopefully in the not too distant future, I'm going to have this entire piece finished and I'll show it to you. So stay tuned, you'll see that. And you'll see my dragonfly all in place in the finished sea glass mosaic. So until next time, I hope you make it out to the beach and happy sea glass hunting.